It's a pleasure to be here. As one of the first speakers said, we always tend to say that at the beginning of a presentation, but indeed it is, and I think that the seminar is very important topic. What I'm going to present briefly, and I think you have in the pack, the seminar pack, the full set of slides. I'm not going to give them all because there's too many, but I'm just going to try and give you some insight into the study that we conducted for the Regional Policy Directorate General of the European Commission in the spring of this year. The study was prepared, I mean, in part, obviously within the overall thinking around the EU strategy for the Baltic Sea region, but also in preparation for a conference in Malmö in Sweden in April, which was looking at the issue of smart specialization and how the regions around the Baltic Sea could prepare for, learn from what's been happening in the last, this current period and previous periods of programming, but also look forward to the next period. If I just point it in the right way, I guess. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. Good, I worked out. So the objectives of the study were to try and give the Commission services and the participants at the conference, but also the member states and regions around the Baltic Sea, an overview of what's really going on in terms of national and regional innovation strategies and activities to support innovation, including with obviously the use of structural funds, so the European Regional Development Fund, the ERDF. And we tried, it was quite a short study, so we had quite a challenging mandate to produce a study in 3 months for 25 regions, and I'm including Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania as one of those 25 regions, if you like. So we took the countries for the Baltic, the 3 Baltic states, and then regions in the other countries. So we had 25 regions, countries to examine and look at and try and understand and summarize the situation in them during that period. Now, the context, I think, is, I'm going the wrong way, try and go the right way, good, getting it worked out. The context, I think you've been given in the previous session, and I don't need to go into it. I think maybe just in terms of the last point on this slide, and if you've been following the discussions on the future of the structural funds and the future regulations, there's certainly going to be a much stronger emphasis from the Commission services on understanding the strategic framework behind the use of structural funds for research and innovation. And that implies, and that's one of the messages I wanted to give, I think, from this presentation, that implies that the national and regional strategies have to be, I think, much more coherent and strong, and above all, have to be implemented. And I think this is one of the difficulties that as I go through the presentation, you'll see we're all clever people, you know, and the previous speaker was mentioning the high level of higher education and so on. In Latvia, it's the same around all the Baltic Sea region. People are smart, and we can all write good strategies. I mean, I don't think there's any country or region that can't put a bit of resources behind writing a good strategy. The difficulty that we have, and that you see really across the countries, across the regions, is implementing those strategies in an effective and operational way. And that's particularly made difficult, of course, when you have a financial crisis and a budgetary crisis that pops up halfway through a programming period. But nevertheless, I think we need to look at how we are designing our strategies. We need to take some harder decisions sometimes about how we're allocating money and really try and focus on where we have real specialization, real potential to develop our regions and our countries. So, in terms of the key findings of the study, what we obviously looked at was the kind of innovation performance of the regions around the country, around the Baltic Sea. Now, it's no surprise that it's somewhat variable, and I think, again, the previous speaker was saying that the 3 Baltic states can be more or less considered in the same sort of level of performance, but even that's quite variable if you look at it in more detail. I think what's very clear as you look around the Baltic Sea region is if you're trying to create a strategy and implement a strategy that's a strategy for 25 regions and a bit more around the Baltic Sea in the field of innovation, in the field of research and innovation, then you have to really take account of where people are starting from. And that's not necessarily meant to be pejorative, it's just a statement of fact. And I think one of the key elements that came out in terms of the study was the structural funds as they bring in money, particularly to the 3 Baltic states, the Polish regions, to some extent northern Germany. The structural funds bring in a lot of additional resources, and within each of those, let's call them southeast region part of the Baltic Sea, within that part of the Baltic Sea, that whole question of how to absorb and implement and use those funds effectively is a huge challenge. And I have an office in Tallinn where I'm very often. I'm also working on a big project in Lithuania for research infrastructure. The challenges of implementing the structural funds to support the development of a knowledge-based economy are enormous. And so we have, on one hand, a lot of money coming into the different regions through the structural funds, trying to, as I say here, level the playing field, so to put people more or less on the same level of infrastructure so they can carry out high-quality research, so that the businesses can connect rapidly to partners around the Baltic Sea, join up with related clusters and so on. And that's obviously a good start and a good thing, but it's still very far. It will be very far at the end of this period from really getting a level playing field. So we have to take that into account when we're talking about a Baltic Sea strategy and how to implement innovation within that. What we also saw, and we did a range of interviews and discussions both with people responsible for Baltic Sea strategy, with the Baltic Sea, different Baltic Sea projects in the field, and also at national and regional level, is that although there's often a commitment to work on a transnational Baltic Sea level, the synergies between the sort of Baltic Sea strategy and the Baltic Sea initiatives and the national and regional strategies, in particular the implementation through the structural funds, remain quite limited. So there's, I think the last speaker pointed out, there's really this need to start integrating much more the different funding instruments and to try and create some form of critical mass around the objectives that are being set. And I think finally there is a strong rationale for increased coordination of the activities, and I think you can see that very clearly when you think about research infrastructure. So the people from the universities, the Academy of Science and so on here today will be very interested in improving research infrastructure in the universities and research centres. But there's a huge opportunity to not only save public budgets to some extent, so not duplicate similar research infrastructure around the Baltic Sea, but also integrate research teams, so really to try and develop a much broader Baltic Sea strategy for research infrastructure, to have specialised centres in Latvia that are being used by researchers around the Baltic Sea and vice versa. And I think this is something which has still not been given enough attention. So I was saying there's a diversity of innovation performance. I won't go into this in depth. I think we can talk about it in more depth later. But we basically split the 25 regions up into 3 types of regions, the sort of highly innovative hotspots, as you might call them. They're probably well known to you. And I think the key element of those regions which are, let's say, leading the innovation field is the businesses driving the agenda there often. The higher education, research sectors are clearly very strong. You only have to look at the indicators for that. But often the business sector is driving a lot of the activity around future research and innovation plans. And obviously there's a lot of work often with the public sector, so this famous triple helix type of cooperation going on. The medium-high innovators, as we group them, are a number of Nordic second-tier regions, Schleswig-Holstein, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and Estonia, setting itself a little bit ahead of the 2 other Baltic states. And there you have a different field, a mix where you have a much higher, stronger importance of the investment into public and higher education sector, but with nevertheless a relatively strong or developing business performance. And then, and I'm sorry Latvia's on the last level, but low to medium low innovators, where at the moment it's driven essentially by public and higher education investment. I'm obviously being very generic here, but it's the way we try to look at it. Now, if we accept that there's some form of diversity of innovation performance, we can also see a sort of diversity of policy to some extent, and the need for diversity of policies. So again, when you're talking about a Baltic Sea strategy and trying to design programs or actions at the Baltic Sea level, we have to take that into account, I think. So the highly innovative regions, who are they trying to compete with? They're not trying to compete necessarily with the regions around the Polish regions or Latvia. They're trying to compete with Singapore, Boston, and so on. So it's really a global stage they're playing on. On the other hand, they can clearly have more arguments to compete on that global stage if they can say that they're working closely with key competent researchers, expanding their research networks or their business networks to the regions to the south and the east, if we think of some of the Swedish regions, for instance. So the potential for those regions to be able to make a bigger case for being global players by saying, yes, we have not only strong research around Gothenburg, but we're working with partners in Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and so on. We have integrated research teams, integrated business networks. We have not only the 3,000 researchers in Gothenburg, but another 3,000 around the Baltic Sea. This is something that shouldn't be forgotten. The second-tier regions are ones that are really starting to try and develop, I think, some specialization, and you can see that in a number of the cases where they're trying to promote regional clusters or innovation platforms, often, again, with public sector involvement. And then the catching up regions are still in this investment phase, and it's not, again, pejorative, it's a reality. Many of the three Baltic states were countries which didn't have a lot of investment into research infrastructure for 20 years. It's needed to bring it up to a level, but we also need to think beyond that now. I think we need to start thinking about structuring research teams, about structuring cooperation between business and industry, and move beyond buildings and equipment. Now, I won't keep this up because it's too small, maybe you can read it on the... What we tried to do was then map, we looked at all the different strategy documents around the Baltic Sea, and we tried to see what are they saying in terms of where they're going to specialize. This was one of the questions of the Commission. They were saying, is there some sort of pattern here that we can actually use as a basis for developing transnational Baltic Sea level cooperation? Now, one of the elements that comes out, or one of the things that struck me was, I think the Baltic Sea is well known for ICT, life sciences, and so on. But actually, one of the elements that came out very strongly, for instance, was wellness. So the health sector, using the health sector as a link to tourism and so on. So a lot of regions were actually not so much in life sciences, but focusing on healthcare and wellness. Other areas that were clearly of interest were developing renewable energies, materials, and so on, but much more fragmented. So this kind of mapping we tried to do was basically to say, are there areas where there's stronger potential for cooperation? Could we imagine a Baltic Sea-wide technology program or linking up competence centers? I know you've launched competence center program recently here in Latvia. There's similar programs in other countries around the Baltic Sea. Can we link up competence centers or have put together national monies with technology programs to work in these fields? And I think the opportunity for that is clearly there, and I think that's something that needs to be, and I'll come to that in the recommendations part, needs to be thought about. There was also a number of regions, I think that was interesting, which were very strongly driven by a much stronger specialization, and I mentioned some of them here. The maritime sector, the Danish regions with food, wind, maritime, IT and wellness in the northern and Finnish regions, and so on. So I think there's a number of cases, examples that people can look at around the Baltic Sea, can learn from, and I think the BSR STARS type initiative, where we try to bring together the different clusters and put them together in a more coordinated program approach, is something that is very interesting for the future. Now, having said that most strategies were saying, yes, we're going to specialize here, or we're going to put our money there. What we saw in reality and through the interviews was that there's often some doubts about how much we can specialize. And this comes back, I think, to what I was trying to say earlier. We can look at our scientific system, we can look at our business sectors, we can say we're more or less specialized in this field of science or in this business sector. We have potential there, this new emerging technology, we've got the basis for following that. And that's easy to say. And then you get into the phase of actual programming, and there's a lot of pressure from all the universities, from all the business sectors, and the money gets kind of sprinkled out a little bit. So one of the problems that we could really see was that both at the strategic level and then at the operational level was actually implementing some form of focusing or specialization of policies. And I think there are elements, again, there around the Baltic Sea that can be used as good practice, as ways of developing that in other countries. A couple mentioned here, the Danish growth forums, the Finnish competence centres, OSKA centres at regional level in Finland, which are, again, building on these public-private higher education partnerships. The three Baltic states, and I can leave Latvia out of this, I'll talk about the other two I know quite well, because we've just finished the evaluation of the higher education and research funding measures under the structural funds in Estonia, and as I said, we're working in Lithuania. The three Baltic states, you all say you're going to focus on something. We're going to specialize here, we're going to do this. And in fact, when you look at the implementation of the programs, the specialization, again, trickles away, and it's very difficult to see the actual specialization in practice. And indeed, the way that investments are being made and the sort of scheduling of different measures and interventions through the structural funds is often quite chaotic. And so you end up, for instance, making your research infrastructure investments and then having a national research infrastructure plan 2 years later. That was the case in Estonia, for instance. So there's a lot of sort of good intentions, not always followed up with, let's say, in practice with trying to really get the investments focused. Now, specialization is also about who's driving that process, and what we see, again, is a sort of split between, for instance, the sort of clusters approach, which is a business-driven approach in the Nordic countries, to some extent the German regions, triple helix partnerships, the Biocon Valley in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern is a good example, I think, which is also a very strong Baltic Sea level actor, with also some other examples. So the Lithuanian Valleys, which was intended to bring together the Lithuanian investments into higher education and research with the business sector, really struggling to actually manage to get that link made through those investments. Competence centres in Estonia, which started 2004, are, I think, a good example of how it can be done. They've been quite successful both in boosting business R&D, but also in creating more doctoral students and improving doctoral research, for instance. Now, one of the other elements we looked at, and again, I won't keep this diagram up, it's in your handout, was what sort of actors are there? Can we see opportunities for bringing together different types of structures, organizations within the region that are working on innovation? And again, there we see quite a diverse and mixed performance. So we see cluster organizations as a key element in a number of the Nordic regions, less strong in the Baltic states and in Poland, for instance. Pomorska is making a big effort to push some strategic clusters, has tried to really focus on 3 or 4 clusters. One of the key elements, I think, and again, this is where, in terms of the market potential, I think we should never forget that option. I think the previous speaker talking about the business sector is really fundamental, is on the other hand, often national markets or regional markets are far too small. So if you want to push clean tech or life science clusters, you really need to be thinking, limit not even just Baltic Sea level, but going global if you're in the life science industry. So how do we use Baltic Sea instruments, Baltic Sea program, Baltic Sea investments to actually help a local Latvian life science company go to the States as fast as possible, piggybacking eventually on a Swedish company or a Swedish research institute? That's the sort of challenge, I think, that we need to be thinking about, because as much as we may think our country, our region is wonderful and big and so on a global scale, we're all small actors. I come from Scotland, by the way, so it's not a big country either, and we have exactly the same sorts of problems. How do we take our best companies out fast into the global market? And I think, again, the Baltic Sea as a platform for that first step is hugely important, but is still underexploited. I mentioned already the research infrastructure elements and how we can structure and focus them, and I'll come back to that towards the end. The science parts, which I think are very active partners in many Baltic Sea regions, still seen as not necessarily as giving enough services. And again, is there a way of learning from each other to improve the quality of service delivery through science parts? So there's a whole series of opportunities that we could identify through the study for increased cooperation and so on through the Baltic Sea strategy. What we also then tried to do was look at to what extent does the strategic framework in each region, each country, to what extent is it actually then reflected in the terms of what the governments are actually spending money on? Now, I'm a simple economist, I'm not a physicist or whatever, and as an economist I always look, where's the money going? Where are we trying to actually spend money? Because often we say things and then we do the opposite in terms of money. So we try to see where is, when we say measure here, is any form of government program or initiative. So we use the databases we run in Brussels to look at where the spending is going. We looked at the structural fund expenditure, and we tried to see to what extent the funding was being focused. And again, here you can see that over 40% of funding programs are, let's call them generic, so these are research innovation programs. And you do see reflected in the funding some of the themes that I said were coming out earlier from the strategic documents or the specialization matrix. You do see ICT, you do see environment and so on, but it's still quite subcritical in some ways. And again, there, the opportunity for stronger focusing, stronger thematic programs at national and Baltic Sea level are certainly one option, I think, for the future. Now, I said that the structural funds, I'm not sure you can read that either, but I said that the structural funds are a key element of investment into the economies of particularly the southern, southeastern part of the Baltic Sea. And that's certainly the case, and certainly into the R&D investments. What we tried to do here, you can look at it on your handout, but what we tried to do here was say, what part of structural fund investment is actually coming from, what part of government expenditure in R&D and innovation is actually coming from the structural funds. So what you can see on the left and right, if you look at your handout, is that in the Swedish and Finnish regions, it's a marginal percentage. In the middle, it's a huge percentage. In some cases, it's up to almost 100%, one of the Polish regions. So the structural funds are in some cases basically the funding instrument for research and innovation in the member states. Now, having said that, if you then look at what share of the structural funds are actually, what's that doing to the relative performance of the region? So up here you've got Copenhagen with gross expenditure in R&D of 2,631 euros per capita, and down here you've got one of the Polish regions with 17 euros per capita on R&D. And then you see what the structural funds are adding in, it basically doesn't change anything. So in terms of actual expenditure per capita, as much as the structural funds are a huge investment into the system, they're not necessarily changing things dramatically in terms of the expenditure. And why? Because the countries that have got the most highest expenditure is business expenditure and R&D. So we can continue to pump public money into the higher education research system, even into the companies to some extent, but it's not going to necessarily, at the end of the day, level the playing field very much in the long term. So what about the contribution of the ERDF? The Commission paid for the study, so they were interested to know what was happening. I think the first thing to say is it's still quite early to observe impact. I said we just finished the evaluation in Estonia. We could talk about, improved coordination, improved this or that, but it was very difficult to put a figure on it. And one of the ministry people said, I need to tell my minister what effect this is having. And that's still very difficult to do in the 3 Baltic states and in the Polish regions. Implementation, of course, has been slow. The financial crisis hasn't helped. But it's still quite early days in terms of that. I think one of the lessons from early programming, if you take one of the East German regions, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, was that they put a lot of effort in the first phase of programming back in the early 2000s in building up research infrastructure, and they told us when we were talking to them, we forgot about the human factor, we forgot about the research teams, we forgot about linking to the business sector. And I think that's something which can be taken as a pretty important lesson for the Baltic states and the Polish regions. Now, in terms of the transnational cooperation element, what we did was we tried to map and look at all the different initiatives, including obviously all the different Interreg type of initiatives around the Baltic Sea, the Nordic cooperation, but also the EU framework program. I won't go into all of those elements here this morning. I think time won't allow that. But again, what we wanted to get over as a message was if you have this diversity of innovation systems, with some systems trying to challenge at a global level, others trying to build up competence centres, excellence centres to compete maybe at first at European or Baltic Sea level, then you need to take that into account in the way you're designing and delivering the programs. And I think a number of the initiatives that have been pushed from Brussels, joint programming of research programs by the Aeronets and so on, could be a useful basis for the future of the Baltic Sea strategy thinking. Now, one other element that we wanted to underline, I think, in the study on the bottom of this slide is that the Nordic partners in this started, as I say, from a kind of innovation performance, business performance perspective ahead, but they also have much, much stronger institutions. So the Nordic Council and the Nordic programs around the Nordic Council tend to be much stronger, and so they have their own top technology programs and so on. And I think that's maybe also something which is maybe an element. We were talking, I think, earlier on about institutions for the Baltic Sea. I'm not a great person for creating new institutions, but certainly the kind of cooperation between the three Baltic states, or the three Baltic states and the Polish regions, to try and coordinate their efforts and work then with their Nordic partners. This could be something which could be, again, thought about in some framework. I'll flick through the next few slides and go to my conclusions, because I think I'm running out of time. Yeah, in terms of one other important element was the extent to which the Baltic Sea region cooperation was an element of the regional strategies. And again, if you look back through the operational programs or the national strategic reference frameworks, which were designed for the structural funds in 2007, you see a lot of, in some countries, a lot of mention of Baltic Sea cooperation. Again, in the reality, partly because of simply the timing question, that the Baltic Sea strategy came 3 years into the programming period, and most countries had already committed a lot of the funding. In reality, the integration of the Baltic Sea element into national programs or regional programs is very limited. And again, this is probably clearest in things like the research infrastructures, where you see, in my opinion, a lot of opportunity for saving public money and concentrating, as I said earlier, research teams at national and Baltic Sea level, building coordinated research teams using similar equipment. And I think later on there will be some people talking about that, for instance, the bonus program, which looks at the maritime sector. So I think in the future there's really a need, when we're starting the programming now, to say, if I'm going to, as a member state or a region, invest another 20, 30, 40, 50 million into research infrastructure, shouldn't I first have a look what's happening next door in the region next door? Or can't I invest into a Swedish centre and make sure that there's access for Latvian or Estonian or Lithuanian researchers in that centre, and that some Swedish researchers and lecturers come and work in our centres? I think this would be much more cost effective, and I think Ministry of Finances in most member states would welcome that sort of approach. So just to conclude then, 5 main recommendations that we made from the study. I think the first is really kind of reinforcing the message of things like the BSR stars and the kind of trying to bring together the clusters. We think there's much, much more potential for macro-region clusters. So bringing together different elements of a value chain of activity within a sector or within a technology field to work together. And I don't think that's going to happen by the sort of project-based approach that's been happening so far. And I think the approach of moving to some form of Baltic Sea program where there's really, people are bidding in for support and trying to link each other up, and it's independent in some ways of what's being done at national level in order to get that Baltic Sea level. I think that's the way to go. The second element is the Baltic Sea vehicle for young innovative enterprises, or let's call it early stage and seed capital instruments. Now, if you look at what's being said in even the Nordic countries, in Finland, Denmark and Sweden and so on, what you see from the reports there is that they're saying our national venture capital early stage funding markets are too small to really have the deal flow for proper investment funds. So there's a real opportunity there for integrating at a Baltic Sea level the sort of investment vehicles that we're trying to also do now at European level through a European Venture Capital Initiative. And I think, again, the Baltic Sea could really has the basis for making a huge contribution to that. And if you look at the sort of specializations that are there, clean tech, life sciences and so on, they are the areas that have huge potential. The open access to Baltic Sea research infrastructure, I think this should be an obligation on member states, on regions, to make available and make it available transparently and through programs, funding for exchange and so on, the research infrastructure they're building, particularly when it's being built by structural funds, but even national funding, I think it makes sense. And I think that has to be coordinated. That's where the Commission and the European authorities also, I think, have a role to try and really push that onto the agenda and make sure that the very sizable €500 million funding in the case of the Baltic state countries that's going into research infrastructure is optimally used. Fourth point, joint programming rather than project-based funding. Now, I'm not saying kill every single bottom-up initiative, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is in the research and innovation field, we need to think about multi-country technology programs. If you look at the difficulty that Estonia and the other Baltic states have had in developing technology-focused programs and initiatives, it's partly due to scale and not having the critical mass, and we've got to be realistic about that. And I think putting together competitive funding programs that are joint programming with national authorities across the Baltic Sea in specific technology fields will be a major step forward. And then I think finally, I mentioned several times human resources, and I think that is a key element. Again, if you look at the sort of expertise that's needed for companies who want to upgrade their infrastructure, their technologies and so on, invest in innovation, if you're in Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, you're not going to necessarily find the best specialists. And that's not, again, being pejorative. It's a reality of any situation. It's the same in my home country, Scotland, or any of the other smaller countries. So making available experts on a multinational level who can come in, give good advice on technologies for companies or work with centres or exchanging of researchers. I think this is, again, something where you could have a programme approach at Baltic Sea level which would give an additional boost to all the national initiatives. Now, I think those 5 recommendations meet to some extent and join up to some extent what's being thought about already. And I think it's really, our message is really probably the time for talking is over, and we really need to think about joining this up if we want to use public funds and in private partnership with private funds as effectively as possible for our national and regional economies. So it's not a game where you're going to lose out on one hand because you're sharing some money with the Swedish or Finnish or Estonian researchers. It's about getting the critical mass to compete at Baltic Sea level and in Europe and globally. And I think that can't be done only through boosting 1 or 2 research centres on a national level and not thinking beyond that. I hope I've kept more or less to time.